That was the sloppiest quali session I have seen since Monza 2019. Now, I'm not saying it was a bad quali session, just really messy. Throughout the entire hour, there was something weird going on and some rather bizarre twists. Ferrari on the front row? We all thought that their engine power was going to be compromised like it was last year, but it turns out that we were wrong. Not only was Nico Hülkenberg really close to getting into Q3, we actually had both Alfa Romeos in Q3. Albeit Zhou got gifted P10 because Alex Albon had track limit issues and was already having trouble with his car. But the biggest talking point I wanted to talk about is that the FIA once again has put its foot in it. It has set a dangerous precedent. Impeding on the track? Very bad. 3-place grid penalty for you. Impeding everyone in the pit lane or the pit exit? Absolutely okay. Why? I don't understand that. This kind of reminds me of what happened with Max Verstappen in Singapore, where he was impeding other drivers and he got away with it. And the FIA did look into it. Everybody got off with no further action, except Logan Sargent, who got a 10-place grid penalty, because when Fernando Alonso span, he just went past at full speed. Oh, okay, to be fair, that was justified. And then he had track limit issues, so he fell foul of the 107% time. So, coming down to earth with a bang, eh, Logan? What I saw in the pit lane was utterly disgraceful. Yes, drivers like to have the ideal time in which to come out so they can set the optimal lap time to get themselves into the next qualifying stage, or set a really good time when it comes to their final qualifying session. But what about all the other people behind them? This wasn't just them waiting on their own or anything like that. You had 8, 9, 10 cars being slowed down, having to interrupt their own lap program, do whatever they need to do, but then some guy at the front is holding them all up because, oh, we got there first so we can control the flow of movement. That was just absolutely shameful. It's just downright rude. And it just makes me think, George Russell doing this, I think he'd be great at Taskmaster. All of the stuff I've seen this season is him trying to think laterally and think technically and going with semantics regarding, oh, well, you never said anything about not doing this, or, oh, I had to do that. Sometimes those moments of thinking laterally don't necessarily work, George. You were very lucky the FIA decided to look the other way. And probably the FIA were also nerved out by the fact that in Singapore, they didn't penalise Max Verstappen, and if they penalised him here, then they might be thinking, oh, it's favouritism! Brah! I think they were aware of what happened in Marina Bay, so decided not to do that. And, okay, what did the FIA exactly say? I will tell you. Ahem. All parties, including the stewards, are firmly of the view that it is better to have the potential of cars backing up in the pit lane or at the pit exit, instead of the potentially dangerous situation of large speed differences on track. We consider that in the main, all drivers involved in these incidents were acting in good faith, and with safety as a priority. Yeah, right. They were out for their own interests. They realised that probably they wanted to optimise the time they came out, so that means they could rely on good old track evolution and track temperature to get their ideal time and hold up everybody else. This is a very dangerous precedent, folks, because not only was this allowed once, it was allowed 3 times. This is making it very clear to teams that, oh, if you go out a little too early, or if there's something meaning that you want to wait and make sure that everything's okay, you could just park up at the end of the pit lane. It doesn't really matter what happens behind you. You're not going to get penalised because 4 times already, this has not led to any sort of penalty. No 3-place grid penalty like you would have got on the track. Okay, I understand why the FIA used that phrasing. It's down to the fact that they would rather have the pit lane being clogged up rather than 2 drivers coming across one another at high speed. That I get. The safety aspect, fine. But I'm pretty sure that the drivers were not doing it for the consideration of others. I'm pretty sure they were doing it for their own self-invested interests, to make sure that they had the optimal time, whereas everybody else, oh, it doesn't really matter about them. So you got drivers right behind them trying to spread out, or maybe try and get themselves around the other driver, but then you run the risk of overtaking them in the pit lane. What can you do? All of those cars were stuck. And they were probably compromised. They would have probably had to go faster to the line than they would have ideally liked, and all of their strategies would have gone up in smoke. They really need to fix that, or come up with some other ruling saying that you cannot do that and compromise other teams' strategies. This was just sloppy. absolutely awful. And then another thing that was awful was Lando Norris. My goodness, what was happening there? So first of all, McLaren claimed that they had an unexpected issue that they are still reviewing as to why Lando Norris couldn't actually set a fast time on his first run, getting a banker lap in on the mediums, which is what some other teams did, including the Ferraris. Therefore, he had to make all of it work on his second lap on the softs, which in theory should have been fine, because I was worried that Oscar Piastri would have struggled because throughout the practice sessions he wasn't doing all that great, but then suddenly, boom, he's right up there with Verstappen, doing really well. And then there's Lando making mistakes again, and him coming back to earth with a bump after a very, very decent Austin GP, where he could have shown Oscar Piastri that, hey, I'm the number one McLaren here. And then suddenly, boom, he's 19th. And then when he's making his interviews, you can tell that he is on the verge of tears. His eyes glistening, he's blaming himself again. And partly that's true, but also McLaren were just doing things really oddly, because they probably should have thought, if there was a little bit of a worry that they should have probably gone out on the soft tyres. We had that yellow flag with Alonso, which in turn took out Stroll from Q1. So for once, Stroll going out in Q1 wasn't necessarily his fault. So as a McLaren fan, this was a very, very bad time of it. You can definitely tell that Lando Norris knew he would have been on the second row. And everyone's talking about P3 being the optimal place to start for the Mexican Grand Prix because you can probably get some good toes. You've got a little bit of ways to jockey things out. You're not having to defend anybody from a half a mile sprint down to turn 1. Wait things out, see what happens. But Lando can't do that. He's going to be right at the back. Or probably McLaren can use this to their advantage, get some fresh components in, change the power unit, change other components, go in the pit lane, adjust the setup to make it more to Lando's tastes, and then go from there, much like how Yuki Tsunoda is doing. But then there's another thing, something that really wants me to get my tinfoil hat out. Daniel Ricciardo, P4, what? What on earth is going on here? Now everyone's going to be thinking, oh, there's a conspiracy theory that Daniel Ricciardo was doing really well and showing up Checo at his home track, and Red Bull planned this and are making his car work better somehow. Well, I kind of want to think that. But there are some things that Daniel Ricciardo is saying which make a lot of sense. In various interviews, he's talked about the main issue he had at McLaren, his own confidence regarding corner entry. He can deal with a car that isn't exactly fast, but if it's well balanced and well positioned, meaning you can get into a corner at an ideal speed and inclination, you can work with that. And therefore that can lean into his style of driving, which he grew accustomed to at Renault and Red Bull, and therefore he can feel confident, which can get you that place, P4 on the grid, right next to Max Verstappen and right ahead of Sergio Perez. And everyone should really be paying attention to the deficit that Perez had to Verstappen, because Verstappen struggled too. He was only 1600ths of a second behind Max, the world champion. And that deficit is much more like what we've seen in averages throughout the entire season from most of the grid. This is the conventional gap. If you're only 1600ths of a second behind your teammate, who's a 3-time world champion, that's not bad. That's exactly what Red Bull needs. They don't need a driver who is on Max Verstappen's level or better. They need a driver who is close enough to be a viable backup if things get a little bit hairy with other teams catching up, which is exactly what is happening. And Daniel Ricciardo is sort of that backup. Because remember, AlphaTauri and Red Bull, when they were Toro Rosso, they worked together as well. The Toro Rosso team was used to Red Bull's advantage in all of the time that we've seen those two teams on the grid. It happens. Daniel Ricciardo is there to act as another backup to Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez if it's required. That's just how it works. They've got another backup in the AlphaTauri, which has managed to pull itself up from being the worst car on the grid to the middest car on the grid, which is really, really surprising. They're now the 6th fastest car, which means that now points are in the offing, and they could potentially overtake Haas and mean that Haas has the wooden spoon, which is not what they wanted. The last time they had the wooden spoon was the Mazepin era. Oh dear. But at the same time though, the timing is just so tragically poetic. At Sergio's home track, he puts in a very good performance to be right behind his teammate, but then suddenly the Ferraris come alive, and then Daniel Ricciardo puts in that blistering performance. And what more does that man have to do? Being that close to Max would be, hey, that's good enough. Being the second driver at Red Bull, that is acceptable. But the media is going to be tearing into Checo so badly because at his home track, with his home fans, and a car that he can agree with, it still wasn't good enough. He was behind Daniel Ricciardo. Oh dear. I mean, there are some ways that I can think that maybe this is something that makes a little bit more sense. The AT04 and next year's AlphaTauri facsimile will be closer to the RB19 in design, going back to the good old days of Toro Rosso. The car's going to morph into something that is more and more like the Red Bull. And which AlphaTauri driver has driven both cars? Daniel Ricciardo at the Silverstone tyre test. Yes, of course, they were using a compounder Pirelli tyre that we are not seeing right now, the 2023 spec, but you can get an overall characteristic feel of the RB19. He's also experienced that car in the simulator, as well as the AT04, can provide very good feedback between the two and help that integration come by at a very efficient rate. And considering the uplift in AlphaTauri's performance over the last few races, this is actually going in his favour. Daniel is a test mule. And then suddenly you get Ferrari, everyone expecting to be really bad, on the front row. What's going on here? This is completely unexpected. But you can explain it with good old science, as the race does so very eloquently. This is a really detailed article talking about how the C5 tyres are very, very temperamental. And in Mexico, where the altitude is very, very high, various changes in temperature, humidity, and track condition can affect the cars even more than you get at conventional circuits at a lower altitude. So that meant as the session progressed and it got later and later in the day, the Ferrari car improved because it chews up its tyres very quickly, and the reducing temperature meant that those tyres, they could work with it. It suddenly worked. And that probably might have been why the Williams car in Q1 was so bad in comparison to the FP1 and FP3 sessions when it was done earlier in the day. It was cooler, therefore the Williams car could work with it, whereas when it was hotter, it wasn't so good. We are going to see this in the race. As the temperature changes, be it higher or lower, cars are either going to improve or get worse. I feel like the Ferrari will be extra sensitive too. I really don't see them being able to hold on to first and second, because we are having the race take place 3 hours earlier than Q3 was. It's going to be earlier in the day when the temperatures are higher, and those tyres, whatever they're going to choose, will not be as effective as they were in Q3. And one thing, Ferrari, please don't start on the soft tyres. They will not work. They will be eaten alive. That's why Ferrari did Q1 on the medium tyres, because they knew that the soft tyres would have been chewed up and spat out really quickly. There is no way those C5s at Mexico in Q1 or even Q2 would have worked doing 2 laps. 1 lap and you're done. That's what Albon was complaining about. So the C4 tyre had to work, and therefore it was ultra sensitive. It was just absolutely bonkers. It was certainly an interesting quali session, but it also had some really awkward points which made me feel really, really bitter and really, really sad, disappointed. I wouldn't be surprised if we see other examples in future races of cars holding up the grid in the pit lane because they know they won't get a penalty, because the FIA will be going, oh, look at them, they're being so considerate, they're not holding people up on their laps. Oh, okay, all right there, dear, no further action, that's okay. You were just looking out for others. Yeah, right. But what else I've been looking on recently is a scenario about Eddie Irvine becoming the 99 champion. If you want to find out what might happen and Schumacher having a bit of a temper tantrum, you can watch this video next. Please watch it, because nobody did.